Welcome to the lecture of RALPH RUGOFF with the comment of TANIA BRUGUERA. It's the last lectures and discussion within a series which we did this year under the title Professional, Amateur or Genius. Amateurism, amateurish methods, procedures and aesthetics have been central topic in art since the beginning of modern movement, but it was never as important as it is now. If you, for example, only think about the internet, how many videos and photographs and music is uploaded every single day, and this is plays a very important role in popular culture. Or if you think about the Venice Biennial, this one which also includes so-called amateurs or outsider artists as they are called. There is a big fascination of amateurism as a method in contemporary art. I would say at the same time the gap between professional artists and amateurs has not diminished. One might even put forward the theory that the more amateurish the methods of professional artists become, the more blurred the boundaries become, the more important it gets to claim a clear difference, specifically if you think about the art market. In many ways, these questions are very central to the Summer Academy. You might know that 6 years ago, in 1953, the Summer Academy was founded by Oskar Kokoschka at the Fortress Hohen Salzburg, and it was his principle from the beginning on that everybody could study, amateur artists as well as professionals and art students. And this is still our principle. At the time of Kokoschka, everybody could study, only say he or she is going to come. Nowadays we have an application procedure where people have to apply with a portfolio and the teaching artists decide whom they take, but we usually take more or less everybody. Tonight I welcome RALPH RUGOFF, and TANIA BRUGUERA. I want to present the two speakers to you. First I present TANIA BRUGUERA, and then RALPH is going to talk to you afterwards. TANIA BRUGUERA was born in Havana, and she lives in Chicago, Paris, and Havana. She is one of the leading political and performance artists of her generation. Bruguera's work researches way in which art can be applied to everyday political life, creating a public forum to debate ideas shown in their contradictory state and focusing on the transformation of the passive condition of viewer into the active one of citizenry. She has many exhibitions worldwide. She was participating in Documenta, Performer, Venice, Guangzhou and Havana biennials, and in exhibitions in many important institutions in Europe and North America, like the MoMA PS1, Whitechapel Gallery, Tate Modern, ZKM Karlsruhe, and so on and so forth. RALPH RUGOFF is, I would say, you are without doubt, for me, one of the experts in our topic of amateurism. He has been director of the Hayward Gallery in London since 2006. He has created numerous exhibitions and projects over the past 23 years, including Psycho Buildings, The Painting of Modern Life, A Brief History of Invisible Art, Wide Open School, which is very interesting for us, of course, because it was an art school last summer in the Hayward Gallery with artists from all over the world. And which is right now the alternative guide to the universe, which explores the work of self-taught artists and architects, fringe physicists, and visionary inventors, all of whom offer bracingly unorthodox perspective on the world we live in. RALPH RUGOFF is also an author, a writer, And the curator, as I said, before being director of the Hayward Gallery, he was director of the CCA Watches Institute in San Francisco, where he also created the show Amateurs, which is a very interesting catalogue, which we have in our library. The Guardian called RALPH RUGOFF one of the most highly respected curators in the global contemporary art scene, and the Telegraph recently wrote, if Rugoff has a philosophy as a director, it is that imaginative responses from the visitors should be encouraged as often as possible. Quote, the artist Marcel Duchamp said that half the meaning of any work of art is made by the viewer. Taking that seriously is a starting point for me. I'm very proud and honored that you're here tonight. It's the second time. RALPH RUGOFF was already here in the year 2000 with the project I created, which was called 100 Days No Exhibition. And the title of your talk is The Return of the Amateurs.
Well, I wasn't going to talk about this slide, but now I have to. This is actually a psychiatric hospital in Mexico City. And the Venezuelan artist Javier Tellez made a film working with the patients there. Some of you, if you went to Documenta last summer, may have seen this film, Artaud's Cave. Maybe we'll get to it later. I'm just going to start by saying that if you happen to be in London in the next 5 days, you will see the end of this exhibition at the Hayward that we have up right now, which includes the work of Karl-Heinz Janka, who was the discoverer of what he called das Deutsche Atom, which he distinguished from the Soviet atom and presumably some kind of American atom. But he also invented a lot of atomic engines and trains. He also had a theory about the origin of life. He made most of his work in a mental hospital in East Germany, what was then East Germany. But very interesting work. You would also see the work of this man, Richard Greaves, who in a forest in Quebec has spent 20 years building these houses that he makes with no nails. It's just timber and string is what holds it together, because he hates the idea of a building that doesn't move, that's fixed. Because for him, that is associated with being lifeless. So he wants buildings that move like living creatures. And you can go into them and walk up on them. And there, you might also see, this is much better on YouTube, and I don't have the link. But there's a Chinese robot maker named Wu Yu Lu, who's a farmer. But since the age of 8, he's been making robots. And he makes very interesting robots. This is a child robot. And I think if you think about China as a country that has an official one-child-only policy, he's making a playmate for the 200 only children who don't have brothers or sisters. But he also makes a robot that smokes cigarettes. He makes a robot that commits suicide. He has a robot that pulls him to the market on a rickshaw. So he's not, there's something quite interesting, I think, about his robots. If you went to the Venice Biennale this year, or if you go later, you'll see this work by an amateur artist, Marino Ariti, which this show takes its name, the Encyclopedic Palace of the World. You would see this work by an American named Morton Bartlett, who made these very lifelike, anatomically correct, half-size dolls of young girls and one boy, which he photographed. You would see these photographs of transvestites that Cindy Sherman collects, and her curated part of the exhibition. So I bring these up just to say that amateurs are everywhere today. And if last week you'd been to Zurich, you could have seen this show at the Künstlerhaus by Cameron Jamie, who is someone who I'll talk about later, but who spent a lot of his work documenting amateur subcultures. And this is a subculture of haunted houses that people create in their homes in different parts of the United States. So why all this interest suddenly in amateurs? And I think the simple answer, and sometimes I like simple answers, is that we become interested in amateurism whenever the culture of professionalization becomes too dominant. And then right now we've seen a kind of hyper-professionalization of the art world over the past 20 years. So to me it's no surprise that we're talking about amateurs again. We all know that the art world has really become a global industry, featuring this ever-expanding infrastructure of art fairs, trade journals, galleries that have become multinational corporations, museums also, international art schools, countless MFA, even PhD programs in fine arts, curatorial studies programs, conferences, conventions, professional organizations, associations, etc. And museums, meanwhile, are often having to deal with the higher costs of putting on exhibitions, which is partly caused by the speculative buying and selling of artworks, which has made things like insurance much more costly. And museums find themselves more and more at the mercy of their marketing departments. The museum's job now is to get as many people through as possible, to sell as many tickets as possible. So all in all, what we see is this massive administrative and bureaucratic structure that enfolds art into the culture industry and squeezes the kind of free space that art is so valuable for. So this situation seems like it becomes more extreme every year, and yet in some ways it's nothing new. Artists have responded and resisted this idea of professionalization since the mid-19th century, at least, when some of the leading early modernist painters in France reacted against the professionalization of the academy and the official salon by defining their art against what were then accepted notions of academic polish, craft, and skill. So I'm thinking of people like Courbet and Manet. And at different art historical moments in the early 20th century, we see groups, projects associated with Dada, with constructivism, embracing an ethos of amateur production, both as a kind of signifier of democratic activity and also as a rebuke to the pretensions of high culture and as an alternative to the idea of alienated labor in a capitalist marketplace. So even only 50 years ago, this man, the amateur chess player Marcel Duchamp, made a famous statement where he lamented the fact that the increasing professionalization of the art world was ruining art. So he's making this statement in the 1960s, the kind of things we might be saying today. We're repeating history. And Duchamp said, in order to avoid a fate of mindlessly churning out formulaic work, of becoming a kind of automaton or an assembly line worker who just repeats the same gesture over and over again to feed the marketplace, the artist of the future would have to go underground. He would just have to kind of completely detach himself from this art industry. And in his own career, and I think I use the word career with quotation marks around it, Duchamp carefully cultivated his image as an amateur, and partly through his interest in chess. He actually participated in the 1924 Amateur World Championship. But above all, I think in his irregular and interrupted production as an artist. He was not someone he was the opposite of an artist who's trying to produce new work all the time and make his dealers happy. And to some extent, I think he embraced this model of the artist as an amateur, as a figure detached from these systems of rote production, echoing to some degree, I think, the aristocrat's disdain of professional activity in favor of a leisurely and disinterested pursuit of knowledge, motivated by whim rather than greed or necessity. So Duchamp articulates what a position that I really associate with the aristocratic model of the amateur, almost a 19th century model. Now at the same time, as Duchamp was calling for artists to go underground, Andy Warhol responded to the growing professionalization of the art world by creating a caricature of the culture industry in the form of his factory. Warhol's factory, as you know, was an assembly line production studio, staffed by a team of many people who had no training in the arts, amphetamine users, drag queens, out-of-work musicians, unemployable actors, porn stars. And it was in his films that I think that he elaborated the most radical use of amateur aesthetics, relying on a cast of what he called his superstars, who conspicuously lacked any normal talents we associate with actors. And in his book, The Philosophy of Andy Warhol, he explained the appeal for him of working with amateur actors. And this is what he said. He said, every professional always does the same thing at exactly the same moment in every show. And what I like are things that are different every time. That's why I like amateurs. You can never tell what they'll do next. And he called his people, the people he worked with, the leftovers of show business, people whose talents are hard to define and almost impossible to market. And for Warhol, I think this unpredictability of the amateur was seen as a refuge of authenticity, oddly enough, even as a kind of truth. He said, no matter what a bad performer tries to do, it never comes off. So it can't be phony. So in other words, a bad performer, it won't work, they can't fool you. So what you end up with is something that's true. And you get a kind of double reading that happens. You know what the actor is trying to do, but it's not working, and you end up with something else. So for Warhol, amateurism is thus an aesthetic strategy, but also an ethical strategy. It's about a kind of truth. The amateur offers the possibility of surprise, of the unexpected interpretation. The amateur is a source of productive mistakes, embodying the notion that in not getting it right, you get it right. In making the wrong move, you make the right move, which is an idea which underlines different historical moments in modernism, I think. In the case of Warhol, also the amateur appears as a caricature of professionalized culture, just as his factory system parodied and to some extent reproduced the values of a Hollywood movie studio, with superstars instead of stars. Now Warhol's mischievous response to this professionalization of culture, to some extent also reflected the anti-authoritarian politics and counterculture of the 1960s. And the same might be said of conceptual art, which likewise cultivated a lo-fi, low-tech, amateurish mode of production, particularly in its embrace of casual modes of photographic documentation. More importantly, perhaps, conceptual art moved away from a focus on making things and instead opened up artistic practice to incorporate a wide range of extra-artistic activities, discourses, and disciplines. Now, a key figure in linking this expanded field of activity to amateur approaches for me, and there are many people, but one important person is the Los Angeles-based artist Chris Burden, who probably became famous originally for having someone shoot him with a rifle in a gallery, the performance Shoot. But Chris also made a lot of work in the mid-70s and early 80s where he took on roles and tasks associated with other professions. In a sense, he became an amateur. His art was made by functioning as an amateur in some other field. So in 1975, he made the B car. There he is driving it very fast. Now, this car was designed to go 100 miles an hour and use and get 100 miles for every gallon of gasoline. So that's fantastic. Not even a motorcycle does that well. And it worked. How is it a work of art? It's another question. But so here was Chris, the amateur car maker. Everyone could have a car of their own. That would be very fast and very economical. He also made CBTV. He reproduced one of the very first mechanical systems for transmitting images and sound. This is actually something that was originally developed in around 1920, very primitive. But it meant, again, that anyone could become a transmitter of television. And this is, of course, many, many years before we had the internet and the World Wide Web, and that was television was a very controlled medium. Sometimes Chris would take on jobs or roles that seemed to overwhelm his capacity. This is a still image from a video he made about a project he did where he bought an enormous truck, a 1952 Ford semi-trailer truck that weighs, okay, it's 16,000 pounds, so I don't know how much, what's that in kilos? It's about 8,000 kilos, very heavy truck. And he thought with this truck he was going to do all kinds of things. He was going to take his B car and his CBTV to shopping malls and charge people a very small amount of money to come and look at them. He was going to start an antique business with his mother, who lived on the East Coast, and he was going to drive the antiques in his truck to the West Coast. He was going to create a mobile communication center in the truck and drive around like a mobile television studio. But for 6 months, he struggled with owning this big truck, and he really didn't know how trucks work. And finally, the truck broke down, and he couldn't fix it. And he realized he couldn't fix it because he didn't have a wrench big enough to remove the cap on the oil, and the oil, he just ran out of oil. But the story of Big Wrench is the story of this artist trying to be an entrepreneur, to wrestle with all these things, and to be a truck driver, and failing. Another of my favorite projects from this time is called Coals to Newcastle. And Chris took these little airplanes and put marijuana joints on them, went down to the Mexican, and it was American-grown marijuana, very important. And he went down to the border of Mexico and flew the planes over the border. So he was reversing the flow of drug traffic, which was mainly coming from Mexico into the United States. And so he took on this role of being a drug trafficker, an exporter, etc. Again, in a way that seemed like, it was a tiny drop in the ocean. But I think in these projects by Chris and other projects, we see this notion of the artist as someone with a license to be a professional amateur. That he can go into any other field without any training, without any accreditation, and operate using his license as an artist to be this kind of paradoxical thing, a professional amateur. I think when you introduced me, Hildegard, as an expert on amateurism, I felt that was wildly strange. paradox is. But this is the position that we see occupied by many people in the contemporary art, many contemporary artists, whose work sees them assume temporary roles. And we see artists who become amateur ethnographers and anthropologists, amateur social service workers and cooks, untrained astronomers, scientists, economists, unlicensed psychotherapists, distillers, black marketeers. These are all, I mean, there was an artist in New York who made a show about growing your own tobacco and selling it. And I think in many instances, artists undertaking this kind of work, and this was true, I think, with Chris Bernin, are essentially performing this role of amateur, usually in order to call attention to social exclusions and cultural divisions within society, sometimes specifically within the art world. And by saying that what they're doing is a type of performance, I don't mean to suggest that this work is insincere or theatrical, but just to note that its engagement with amateurism is strategic and paradoxical. Because few artists, if any, ever want to surrender their status as an artist to become a real amateur. Because to do so, of course, would mean giving up your cultural visibility. And it would also negate the artist's potential position as a critical voice of opposition within official culture. So artists don't really want to be amateurs, but they like playing the role of the amateur. That's an important distinction, I think. And there's Chris in his flying kayak from 1982. Okay, this is a postcard of the Brand Library in Glendale, California, about half an hour outside of Los Angeles. Why am I showing you this postcard? It's because this is where, in 1991, Jim Shaw put on an exhibition of paintings that he'd collected from thrift stores around the United States over the course of 6 years of making car journeys back and forth across the United States. And he was an obsessive thrift store shopper. And he looked at tens of thousands of paintings by unknown artists that he found in these thrift stores. And he put together a little exhibition in the library. And to me, this show is kind of a funny landmark of a shift or another vein of this artist activity opening upwards, artists who curate the work of amateurs, artists who present the work of amateurs, rather than acting like an amateur. So here's the catalog from this show. And I just have a few examples of paintings that most of them weren't in the original exhibition. These are just things I could find online. Jim picked the paintings, really looking at things that had unusual content or unusual formal solutions as paintings. Sometimes unusual imagery, often kind of a surreal quality. And these were all things that reflected his own bias as an artist. And the paintings that were actually in this show are much better than the examples I've been able to find online. And it was quite an astonishing show where you went into this library and you looked at this work. And one, the subject, the range of subjects in the paintings was so broad, things that you'd never seen in an art gallery. People were making pictures, very interesting things often. Then there was a real range of approach. And it was a very exciting show to see. And it made work by contemporary painters, by comparison, seem very tame and timid and academic. And it made you wonder, why are professional artists not more free in what they're doing? Why are they looking at such a narrow idea of what you can make a painting about? And so in some ways, I thought that this show was a critique, indirectly, of those insular aesthetics of the official art world. And that at the same time it seemed to propose a scenario where the work of these anonymous Sunday painters was at least as interesting as the work of professionals. And it was interesting to me that about 5 years after doing this show, this is actually a slide of an installation of Jim's own paintings, that he taught himself how to paint like a thrift store painter. He really began to develop an approach and a style, and again, this is not a great slide, but so what allows this convergence in an exhibition like this, saying that, you know, the amateurs are worthy of our attention as much as the professionals? And obviously, the only thing that makes this statement possible, this convergence between amateur and professional, is the conferred powers of artistic nomination of the professional artist. So in other words, the thrift store painting exhibition became culturally visible. It got reviews in art magazines only because it was curated by Jim Shaw, the artist. Otherwise, no one would have paid any attention to it. Now, I think, to me, what was quite interesting, and I think this also was something that we saw in the work of Warhol, and it's here this child contemplating this strange apparition, is that what's interesting in Jim Shaw's thrift store painting show is that the amateur is not a figure of purity. I mean, we might imagine the amateur, he's detached from the world of commerce. You know, how do we define an amateur? The word means someone who does things out of love, not out of any commercial motive. But what was interesting about these amateurs in Jim's show was not that they were pure, but the way their work mixed up different genres, different aesthetics, different painterly protocols, different symbolic systems, in very unexpected ways. So it's precisely by failing to successfully mimic our dominant cultural conventions and codes of painting that these amateurs, their impure formulations, could provoke us to look again at what we consider to be the state of things, and to see whether or not there were limitations to the right way of doing things, whether there was much more that could be explored than what the professionals were exploring. And so just as Warhol was interested in the unpredictability of the amateur, I think that's the strong thing that we see in this work here. So some later projects where artists, I think, are also interested in exploding any lingering notions we have about cultural spheres being very distinct from each other, and somehow they don't talk to each other. This was a project started in 1999 by the Long Art Foundation, which was a group of artists and a curator in Beijing. The great survey of paper cuttings in Wanchong province. And they really operated like some kind of amateur government agency, because paper cutting is like a folk art in this province particularly. And they surveyed 16,000 people who were making paper cuttings as amateurs. And then they put together this exhibition. And in putting all of this work together, they discovered that actually, depending on the age of the paper cutter, they could trace different influences that had come in from China's engagement, both with the Soviet Union, former East Germany, but also from modernist art. And they could look at work and go, yeah, this has a constructivist influence. You know, this has, we see the, Mondrian as an influence here. And so something that we think of as a kind of naive folk art actually was in a conversation with what we consider to be fine art. And I think it's worth pointing out that someone once said, if we use the word folk art, actually the word for fine art should be art of the gentility, art of the upper classes, because folk is the people. So that's, I think, so this, I think, was a really interesting project, again, of artists presenting work by amateurs. Another project, the Folk Archive by the British artists Jeremy Deller and Alan Kane, That's a mechanical walking elephant there, Snowdrop the elephant. It actually does move on its own. And they collect banners, photographs of shop signs. They say that it's basically, all the work is work made by people who don't think of themselves as artists. And the artists said that when they were looking for work, they applied all the same criteria they would when looking at works of art. They wanted things that evinced humor, modernity, insight, a refreshing directness. They wanted work that tackled ambitious subjects, that went beyond normal expectations. All the same things that we want from works of art, but they wanted it from people who were just putting this out there in their everyday lives. And on one level, this project is about what we can gain from vernacular visual culture that's not hampered by concerns with art history or art theory. But it also asks a question, and do we have any common culture that exists that's not controlled by corporations? So that's not pop music, that's not media, TV, movies, but it's something about individual people who make. And I think Hildegard mentioned this earlier, that now, thanks to the World Wide Web, we have access to all kinds of amateur production. And the other interesting thing I think about this project is that, well, on the one hand, they're saying, look, creativity exists in all these different sectors of society that we neglect, that the museum pays no attention to. On the other hand, this wasn't really a utopian project, because they included in the folk archive objects that were racist and objects that were politically reactionary. And I think that was an important aspect, that it wasn't about some harmonious, happy society, but they brought together objects that had contradictory values, and it could unsettle and disrupt each other. So I think one thing about the artist as curator that you see is it really comes out of enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is something we should never underestimate. Enthusiasm is like a divine gift. To be enthusiastic about something, you know, I think it can lead you in so many ways. And the amateur, of course, is a beacon of enthusiasm, because they're not doing what they're doing because they have to, but because they love it. If pop art is about liking things, as Andy Warhol said, then folk art is about loving things. And that's a quote from Jeremy Deller. And it refers to the people making this work, but also it refers to the curator's attitude as a kind of die-hard fan and supporter of this work. And I think the logical next step in this kind of artist as curator is artists who commission amateurs to make exhibitions, and this was the case for the artist Terrell Fletcher. He was doing an art project at an art center in Hartford, Connecticut, and he started talking to his taxi driver. The taxi driver said he'd always wanted someone to make a bust of him. So Harold put out a call online and asked people if they wanted to contribute a bust of Steve. They put a picture of Steve online. And then they had an exhibition of all the work that came in. He looks a bit like Saddam Hussein in one of these in the middle of it. Another earlier exhibition by Jeremy Deller from 1997 was he took out advertisements in music magazines and went to concerts for the band the Manic Street Preachers. And he was asking their fans to send him material that they made in response to the band's music. And Jeremy chose the Manic Street Preachers because a lot of their songs made reference to the history of art, literature, social conflict. And he put together a very interesting exhibition from all the work that he came in. He included everything that was sent to him. So he operated not as an institutional curator, but more as a fan. And I think that was an important move to make, because it took away the idea that you didn't look at this work trying to evaluate, was it good art or bad art, but more what kind of use it reflected of the person who made it. What kind of use had they made of the band's music? And one person, you see this shelf of books, one young woman just sent in all the books she had read because they'd been mentioned in songs by the band, half of them which had been banned from her local library. So the idea was that somehow the right kind of pop music, instead of providing a distraction or background music to our lives, could help people re-educate themselves. You know, that great endless amateur activity of learning on your own. And Jeremy also, I talk about Jeremy a lot because we did an exhibition with Jeremy last year, but he's done a number of processions in different cities where he invites different groups in the city to march in the parade. This was from a procession in Manchester, and it included, again, groups who don't really get together. So there would be the Historical Society would be marching, but so would the Custom Car Club. He would get the groups of disaffected teens who all the merchants hated because they would hang out in front of their shops all night. And here he got the unrepentant smokers, the smokers who don't want to give up. And the banner, you see it says DH, that's David Hockney, who drew the picture. David Hockney is an unrepentant smoker. And so they're marching and smoking, you know, again, a kind of commissioning curator. Again, a different approach to looking at this amateur cultural practice. This is artists who documented in their work. So their work is about this amateur subculture. So it's their work, but at the same time it's like an ethnographic documentation of it. And this is an image from a film called Cranky Klaus, which I hope everyone in Salzburg knows, because it's about a ritual that happens in Bad Gastein Valley, which is not far from here, right? The Krampus, every December when these young men put on these incredible outfits which have been passed down from father to son since the late 19th century. They're kind of half goat, half human, and they walk around the town for 12 hours, and they go to the gas stations, the restaurants, the hotels, the youth clubs, and they also burst into people's homes and terrorize them. And the film is about this activity. They beat people up, they make children cry, and have nervous breakdowns. And it's this very strange confrontation between this very primitive ritual and consumer culture. I mean, here they are at the shop, terrorizing the people who want a candy bar and a soda. And this is what the masks look like in the front. So this is a film, a wonderful film by Cameron Jamie. Again, here are some more of these pictures of spook houses, mainly in working class suburbs outside of Detroit and outside of Los Angeles. And you would pay, say, $1 to go into somebody's private home where you might see a performance like this. There will be a child lying on the dining room table covered with blood, and his mother will be pretending to cut his head off. It's a culture that's been going on for a long time. It's like a kind of native Grand Guignol to these parts of America. Sometimes the content is very political. It's not just Frankenstein. It will be the head of George Bush or Osama bin Laden. And so they reflect in a very interesting way what's happening in the larger American culture. Now for an artist like Cameron Jamie, he is documenting this work, but of course he also presents it as his own work as an artist. And my personal take on this is that the material he's documenting, and the fact that he documents it in a very artless fashion. It's very basic photography, very basic video documentation. You're not paying attention to the work of the artist, you're really focused on the content that he is showing you. And there's a little contradiction there between what you know, his role is as an ethnographer of amateur culture, and I have amazing respect and admiration for his ability to find very interesting local traditions, which are kind of folk traditions, contemporary folk traditions in some cases, but that resonate with other things that are happening in culture. But there's an issue here where the artist is curator of amateur work, or is this kind of ethnographer, inevitably possesses a kind of ventriloquized voice. He speaks like a ventriloquist, in other words. Their identification with amateur techniques, with the production of folk or low forms of culture, or their willingness to put the production of art into the hands of amateurs or non-artists, builds up an identity for the professional artist as someone who speaks through that which is other to what they are. So you can wonder, is this something that artists are doing because they don't want to be seen as a certain kind of professional artist? They want to have an appearance of having distance from that situation. And yet at the same time, I think by showing this kind of work in galleries and museums, the curator artist or the ethnographer artist is inevitably questioning what official institutions will present as art or legitimate as appropriate subject matter for art. And this amateur work poses a real issue for a lot of museums and galleries, which are often the worst places to look at art of any kind. I mean, I think there's it's a terrible thing to see what happens to different kinds of art when you put it in the official gallery context. You have to have a certain kind of lighting, of course, you have security guards, you have wall texts. Museums, in general, I think, tend to sterilize the objects that they show, and they create a lot of static that interferes with our experience of the work. And everyone's trying to make this a better situation in the museum where lots of people are, but it's a very tricky thing to do. Also, just culturally, in a given city, a museum, you know, the Hayward Gallery is not the biggest gallery in London, but it occupies something in people's imagination in that city. And just by showing something in that place, people start to assume it must have certain qualities to it, and they must approach it with reverence and respect. So I'm looking at artists who made different types of kind of more amateur galleries, and again, sorry to bore you with Jeremy Deller, but this was a recreation of his first ever show, made in 1994, which he made in his parents' house. And it was called Open Bedroom, and that was a joke on the fact that most artists, when they would have open studios in their studio as a way to try to show their work for the first time and to get dealers to come and look at it. Jeremy never went to art school, he didn't have an art studio, so he did the Open Bedroom show, and he was living at home with his parents, and he did this, he waited until his parents were away for 2 weeks on holiday, and then he turned most of the rooms in the house into part of his exhibition. There was his bedroom, and you see this sign, you treat this place like a hotel, which is something parents say to their children when they don't pick up after themselves. And even the bathroom had an installation. In this case, he found some very interesting graffiti in the men's toilets in the British Library, which had obviously been written by scholars who were writing obscene limericks to each other. One guy would come in and the next guy would put a response, all very British. And the interesting thing, I think, in this idea of this show, which obviously wasn't about trying to attract dealers, was that it was a show very much about middle-class British culture, which is where Jeremy comes from, about its insulation. And obviously, if you look at this work in this context, you can't separate it from the artist's background, from his place in that society, from the cultural upbringing he had. And he has a dialogue with that, rather than just to pretend it doesn't exist. And to me, that adds an element of subjectivity which is quite interesting. And I think all these artists who are doing different types of museums are interested in some kind of subjective presentation that activates us instead of this objective presentation which deadens our experience. So this was a project, image from a project that Thomas Hirschhorn made called the Musée Précaire Arminet. He worked with 12 young people from the neighborhood of Aubervilliers, which was a working class kind of area outside the center of Paris where he has his studio. And they borrowed works from the Pompidou. And they were works made by artists who Hirschhorn thought had tried to change the world with their art. And it included Mondrian and Leger, and also Joseph Beuys and Andy Warhol. And these were works that cost millions of euros. And the Pompidou agreed to lend them to this museum in Aubervilliers, which was made out of cardboard and staffed by young people from the neighborhood whose only training was a crash course in museum administration that they got at the Pompidou and at the Lyon Biennale. And the way the work was shown, Thomas picked the actual art to go into this exhibition that he thought was important. He made these selections. But the atmosphere inside was very much a collaboration with his young people he was working with. And there would be music playing in the gallery, kids hanging out and running around the cafe. It was a completely relaxed atmosphere, like you were going to a neighborhood youth club. And I think this allowed people a very different way of engaging with the work and with the ideas around it. You know, it wasn't like going to church anymore where you had to speak in a quiet voice. People could relate to this work like they would relate to anything in their life. It's just something there that might start a conversation. It doesn't have to be a holy relic. And oops, I missed another picture. Well, there's a very interesting project by Harold Fletcher, again, where he went to the War Remnants Museum in Hanoi, which is a very homemade museum dedicated to what the Vietnamese call the American War. And of course in America, everyone calls it the Vietnam War. But it was a museum made of photographs and with captions. And Harold went and photographed the whole museum, and he photographed everything at an angle so he wasn't getting the reflection from the glass over it. And then he reconstructed this amateur museum in his very amateur documentation in America, and it toured around the country. And in America, of course, this information that was in this museum was information nobody knew about. It was the opposite history of the war from what people know in America. And so I think Fletcher felt that it would hopefully encourage people to become amateur historians, which he had become when he first saw this museum and he started to study the entire history of the war again. But also just the fact that he's taken these pictures at an angle, and sometimes you see his shadow on the wall, you understand that a point of view is something particular to a particular person in a particular situation, that there is no objective point of view. And that's obviously true with history and museums that present history. So these days, I think perhaps the most common type of amateur institution created by artists, and this is maybe going on for the last 10 years, is the artist-run school. And there has been a prolific growth of experimental, usually temporary schools founded and run by artists and sometimes curators. They're too numerous to mention, and I must say when I was working at the project of the Hayward for about a year, I noticed every week I would get an announcement from eFlux of a new project somewhere in the world started by artists, a new temporary school. And of course I will acknowledge TANIA Brugera's Cátedra Arte de Conducta, the Behavior Art School, which she ran from 2002 to 2009 in Havana. Most of these schools are run by artists and they're working often without pay. Others are set up by artists and run by members of the public. And I think the students, I don't consider professional students because there are no professional degrees offered, no professional accreditation at any of these schools. So I've been looking at this interest for a long time. Before working at the Hayward, I worked as director of an art gallery that was part of an art school. And when I was there, I was always interested in creating an art school within the art school in the gallery that would be open to the general public, not just to the art students. So it seemed like this was a good time to respond to this interest in education by artists, and also to this amateur activity of artists, because art has become this open discursive forum. Any subject can be a subject appropriated and that an artist uses to make a work of art on. So we did this project last summer, Wide Open School. It was on for 30 days. There were 100 artists who came from all parts of the world. And they would come and teach for 2 days, 3 days, at the most a week. And we were amateurs when it came to making a school, so it was a learning experience for everyone. But the invitation to the artists was to try to teach something that they were enthusiastic about, or that they wanted to learn about themselves, not to teach their own work, not really even to teach art, unless that's what they wanted to do. And I looked for artists who were not teachers in normal art schools, and I made many exceptions to that rule because so many artists are teaching. But ideally I wanted artists who don't normally teach and would have to really think about what they were doing in a different way, or who taught in unofficial situations. So there were many different kinds of classes. I don't know if you can see some of these things, but there are... oh, there's the Harold Fletcher American War Pictures. Okay, these are some photographs that he took at this exhibit in Hanoi. So anyway, Cullinan and Richards, who were here not too long ago, did a wonderful class where they were learning about boxing and painting, and how you could become a better painter by knowing about boxing and vice versa. So they had theoretical discussions about painting, and in between they had boxing lessons with a boxing coach. Pedro Lash taught this class in the London Eye, this big Ferris wheel in London. And this was a class on nonlinear space. And this was another class he taught, really looking at issues around finance and global business, and looking down at the actual institutions in London from this structure. So it's a half-hour ride, so you need a half hour to do each class. Song Dong, an artist from Beijing, did a 5-day class about kind of meditative performances. And he had his class face the wall and face each other and face objects. And then they also had to do a group hug, an individual hug on the terrace. This was a class by Sao Fei and Pak Xiong Chun, which was based on a Six Dynasties era ritual where poets would sit by the river, someone would float glasses of wine down the river, and the poet would pick up the glass and immediately, spontaneously compose a poem. So in this class, there was a little tiny river, artificial river, flowing here, and there were little glasses of sake floating around. And when someone in the class wanted to speak, they would take a glass, drink it, and then make their contribution. Sometimes, but not always, on a subject chosen by the artists. And that was a very interesting class. This was a class in destruction, where people were asked to bring in an object that they really liked and allow it to be destroyed as part of this group sculpture. And this was kind of, Michael Landy is very interested in the work of Tingley, and this was an homage to Tingley. And Gelatin came and did a class called Teach Us, which was very much the spirit of the school. One of the teachers in the school said, this is a school for people who love learning but hate being taught. And I thought for me, that was sort of the motto of the school. I hate being taught, but I love learning. It's the most interesting thing you can do, and you never want to stop. So how do you have a school where no one's being taught, but everyone's learning? That was this issue we struggled with. And in thinking about it, I was also interested in this book, a wonderful book by Jacques Rancière called The Ignorant Schoolmaster. And I am too old to really enjoy reading most French theory. This is more history, not unlike something Foucault might have written, about this amazing educator in the 19th century who really developed a way of teaching a subject that you knew nothing about. And his ultimate goal was that illiterate parents could teach their children how to read. So someone who doesn't know how to read could actually teach someone else how to read. His system for this book is explained, his system is explained in this book. And it's a mystery to me why this system isn't universally adopted, because it actually does make sense. It sounds crazy, but it makes sense. And that would mean that basically all education could be done by amateurs. You don't have to be an expert suddenly to teach a subject. So Georges Adeabo came, and this was a very interesting class because Georges' partner is German, Georges is French. He has such a heavy accent that it's almost impossible for French people to understand him. And so Georges would say something to his partner, who would then translate it from his German into English. And to an English audience, mainly English-speaking people. But that was very interesting to me. This class was incredibly successful. They made lots of work. They went to the flea markets. They all became like little Georges Adeabos, who comes to a city, starts collecting things that he sees around him that makes a portrait of his experience in that city. And I do think that the way artists work and the way artists think is something that can't be taught. So I was very interested, for me, the content of this school, no matter what the class was supposed to be about, it was always about how do artists think, how do they solve problems, how do they ask questions. That was the real content. And of course, that's what you hope people get when they come and see an exhibition. We're always saying, what is art good for? It helps us see things in new ways. It helps us think about things in new ways. So this was an experiment, and could we take that a step further in terms of people's involvement in that process? This was an amazing class by Makoto Nomura, who's an experimental musician, where he just worked with gamelons, but also with just everyday objects. And I saw a performance the class did after being together for 3 days. And there was an old Englishman in the class who played the umbrella. He would kind of open his old umbrella at certain key moments and close it. And they gave one of the best performances of kind of musique concrète that I had ever seen. And I was so moved that this had happened with a group of strangers coming together, working for 3 days. It wasn't just like, oh yeah, that's a nice thing, pat them on the back. It really was amazing. So there were moments like that in the school. Here's Ernesto Neto did a class on movement and sculpture and dance, the two things is together. And this class would be running all around the school and bursting into people's classrooms. There was a lot of energy. This was a class on how to move through a city without being seen by Jochen Den. This was a very interesting class by Olaf Nicolai. Brought about 20 students from the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich. They were all interested in mountaineering. And they actually had a climbing wall outside, and they would also do demonstrations of barbarian whip cracking. But inside, here they're loosening up for the climbing wall. They had tents, and they had continuous screenings of films about mountains. They had 5 projections going. They had a lecture about the role of mountains in the philosophy of Heidegger. It was a complete mountain workshop. And that was a fantastic atmosphere in there. Really, that was a great project. This just is one of my favorite class pictures. Kidlat Tahamik is a Filipino filmmaker. Duende, is like a kind of your soul or something. And he really did a class that was a kind of performance where he pulled all these objects out of his suitcase and one by one started interacting with the objects and with his class. And here's Tania's class. creating a profession, which this class was very, gave me a lot of grief. They called me in for many meetings and said, our project is that the White Open School should be free. Why isn't it free? And in fact, what we did is we charged, ticket of an exhibition was the price for anyone to take a class. So I thought that was pretty fair. But they really wanted to be completely free. So we had very interesting discussions. You know, it was, finally, yeah, we had Jeremy Deller, and the man next to him, Ed Hall, is a banner maker who makes banners for political movements. In this class, they made a banner for the school, White Open School. No idea is set in concrete. That's kind of a joke because the Hayward is in a concrete building. So, you know, I think one of the things that I think when I think back on this project, and it was a crazy 30-day period. It wasn't a practical project. This could never be a normal model of a school. But it made me think that contemporary art occupies this unusual position. It lacks there are no clear standards of evaluation in contemporary art, right? You can't take a master's test that everyone in the country is taking. Everyone is agreed that there are certain technical or aesthetic criteria that can be used to ascertain whether a work of art is successful or not. We argue about it. We know that some things are more interesting than other things, but there's no structure in which to define this expertise. So in a way, it's a field without expertise. And I think that artists are such interesting models for education, one, because they're constantly teaching themselves all the time how to do things they don't know how to do, but also because they know how to make their own lack of expertise into something productive. And they're also very good, as we know, at working in the dark. By that I mean working on a project where you don't know what the outcome is, you're not really sure what it's about, but you keep going, you don't stop, you're not paralyzed because you don't know where you're going, which I think is what happens to a lot of people. So these were things that I think for people who want to do amateur education, that's the most important thing you can teach. And because I was running around like crazy during this whole experience as a sort of all-purpose handyman and complaints officer, it's hard for me to judge the success of the school, but I think there were many remarkable moments, and it was embraced by the participants with real enthusiasm, and that's what moved me, and also an impressive openness to experimentation, that people from the public would come into a situation like this, interact with each other, try to do strange things, talk about ideas. And there were classes, you know, where people got very emotional. There were classes where people got angry, classes where people were crying for one reason or another, classes where people were suddenly taking off all their clothes, which was not part of the plan originally. And all of this was unusual behavior for us to see in the gallery. As much as we think that we make works of exhibitions that people will care about, I've never seen someone crying looking at a work of art in Hayward. So how are we doing for time?
It's 1 hour?
This is 1 hour, okay, enough. Tanya, come on, let's have a conversation.
So I think I kept thinking, I mean, the presentation was very clear also, and the sense of, it felt to me that you have different models of approaching this amateur, like either when the artist is claiming that space from other people's practice, or, you know, there are many, many different models that you presented, but it seems to me that everything is art-centric.
Yes, I think that's pretty true.
I mean, like, I kept thinking that the value of failure in that other area is something that is even celebrated in a way, but what if you go to another area, let's say if you want to be a biochemic amateur, but you have to actually find something that for them is also interesting, because you feel that all the examples and the perspective is more about making people in the art world exciting about something else, instead of maybe being a mediator in creativity between two different fields. I don't know what you think.
You know, I think it's very interesting. I think of two cases. There was a conceptual artist in San Francisco who decided as an artwork that he would run for mayor of a small town, right? And he became the mayor of the town. And for him it was an artwork, for everyone else he was the mayor of the town. And as an artist he disappeared. You know, another person I think of is, gosh, I forget her name. She's a wonderful artist in New York in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And she made work that gradually was more and more removed from objects. So one of her last projects was she spent many hours with the guards at the new museum talking to them about the show that they had on. And it wasn't their show, it wasn't her show. But she wanted them to become incredible thinkers and talkers about this work. So there was no sign that this was a work by this artist. But if you happen to be in there, you might just think, wow, the guards here are incredible. These guys are so on. And her last work, I think, in the gallery was an empty room. And then she decided, you know, I think for what I'm interested in, the way I want to reach people, I'm better off becoming a social worker. I'm going to leave the art world. And some people think that was her last work of art. So there's a moment where, you know, it's like the old thing, where if you simulate robbing a bank, you will be treated by everyone as if you're robbing the bank. If you go in and you just pretend to rob the bank. So I think if an artist leaves that idea, this is why this is such an interesting area. I mean, in your own project, you know, you left the flat in Queens. You can leave behind that project and continue to do new things. But the other thing for you to say was, I'm going to become an immigrant.
I am an immigrant.
You are an immigrant.
I
That's true.
I am already.
But you're a famous immigrant.
I'm a privileged immigrant, which is a different category. Yeah. No, but I was thinking also because the whole time you were presenting, I think about this artist from Costa Rica who was a prisoner. He was actually somewhere in prison, and then through this kind of art, social work, use of art, they had people from Teoretica, which is a pretty well-known art institution in Central America, to go to the jail with some artists to do artist project with the prisoners, and he became an artist. Like, they really liked so much his work that he became an artist, started showing an exhibition. But it feels like when you go into art, you can be an amateur until a certain point. And then he had to go to a Rights Academy. So he became now he's a real artist. And I had as an advisor a discussion with him because he was in a crisis. Because he cannot play the prisoner anymore. Now he was a real artist with other problems. I think this idea of amateur can be also as much as enthusiasm is going on, but then if you really take it seriously, the same way the mayor, no? You have to, there is some kind of professionalization that is asked, like what do you, I don't know.
You know, it's very tricky. I mean, I see this in a lot of museums now are showing work by so-called outsider artists, self-taught artists, but almost no museums are collecting this work. The Tate Modern Gallery in London will say, we do not collect the work of outsiders. They were recently offered work by one of the most important outside artists of the 20th century, and they turned it down. Why? There's no museum in London that collects that work. Is it not important? And there is an issue that the amateur, this museum view is that art is an enclosed system. It's a conversation, that it has a progression, and that the amateur is having some other kind of conversation, or a monologue. So they don't know how to work this in. How do you see how do you, I mean, I saw an amazing exhibition today at the Altnoter Gallery by this outside artist, incredible figure from the late 19th, early 20th century. Amazing drawings and paintings. I encourage you all to go and see it. Well, where would you put this guy in the history of art? It's very weird. Some of it looks very modern, some of it looks completely different. So there's a clash of these cultures. And I think that some of the work of it, artists who are interested, they're interested in the fact that the space between these two cultures is almost irreconcilable. Which means it's a kind of, there's an open space there. I mean, I do think we have to ask if a lot of this is a romance. We were talking before, you know, the early 20th century, there's this romance with the primitive is something that's outside Western European culture. Then we have the romance of the outsider artist. And is this romance really a way, if you're a professional artist, to distance yourself and maybe to thumb your nose a little bit at the establishment because you are not comfortable being a professional artist making work in this industry?
Yeah, I'm glad that you say industry because it has become a total industry, this art world. But also the other thing that I was thinking is kind of your conversation, your presentation was more from this world into the arts, like the path between this general world into the art world. But I want to talk maybe about the opposite, because I don't know if there exists now this amateur audience situation, but also, and at the same time,
YouTube.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, you have this, like Harvard and all these Ivy League university recently created a degree online where you can actually access all their lectures with the most fantastic professor, very expensive professors, online
Free?
for free.
Really?
Yes, this is something recently, a few months ago, happened. So I think it's interesting now how like high culture or high knowledge institution or very professionalized and very expensive institution feel this need to do the other way around. Not only attract these people to that, like, but also go into this amateur world.
Yes, yeah, it's very, very interesting. I mean, how many people here would go to have surgery from an amateur doctor? So there are these professional, you know, systems that we have of accreditation, often to make sure that people are properly qualified. But I think that's why art is so interesting.
But they give an online certificate.
They do?
They do. If you have, of course, several credits and you have to go to exams, the system, and so on. So I think this is interesting also how to...
Yeah. But no, I think, you know, the place where interesting work is happening, like a lot of it is on YouTube. And that's where it goes out to a non-art audience. I would love to see someone curate a show just of things that are on YouTube. Most artists I know still spend 3 or 4 hours a day watching things on YouTube. And they find the really interesting things.
That's what you do with Facebook.
Yeah,
you curate
Facebook,
YouTube because you put what you like the most on Facebook, and this is kind of creating exhibition space.
But it's funny because Cameron Jamie in the early 90s, he was always interested in subcultures. And there was a network, this was before the internet really got going. People would mail each other weird videos that they had found from one way or another. And he would have these incredible videos that were like Paul McCartney performances, but they were just done by teenagers in New Jersey. And there was this whole sense of a different kind of, you know, but in a way, the artist then, it's funny, artists don't usually curate the work of artists, but sometimes that does happen. But it takes an artist to curate the work that's not officially designated as art. Again, a normal curator did that. It's funny, I don't think it would have the same, you couldn't present it in the same way.
No, but is it because the curator doesn't have, it's part of the description of the artist to do this kind of curating amateur videos, but if a curator does it, the curator has kind of the power to say what is art and what not.
Exactly.
Yeah?
That power we only give to artists.
Which makes me go back to some of your slides. I was very curious because in 2 slides you put Jeremy Deller and Company and Thomas Hessian and Company.
Lots of people involved. I mean, again, the artwork only acknowledges one person, right?
Yeah, but I think this is interesting that it is, there is no space for these other kind of collaborators, amateur collaborators, because I'm sure, no criticism, but I'm sure that if you were 5 important artists, you will be like all the slides say, by this, and this. So I think it's interesting how much it becomes like a use value as well, this idea of amateur.
Well, something interesting happened, I think, with the Jim Shaw thrift store painting show, in that a big London collector offered him a lot of money. And Jim wouldn't sell it because he said, this isn't my work. You know, I can't sell this to you. I'm an artist, but this is not my artwork. But he changed his mind eventually. And for me, actually, it was like an artwork. The whole thing. It was like an artist working with found objects. Because it was so much about him, his eye, and the kind of things he found things. I mean, he looked at tens of thousands of objects to find the really interesting ones. So I thought it was right on the verge. Was it an artwork or was it a curatorial piece? And so a lot of this work, I think, is interesting because it calls into question the definition of the artist, the definition of an artwork, sometimes, and that's becoming harder and harder to do because we've done it so much.
Yeah. But also it feels, I don't know, but when you were talking, you also felt that this idea of failure, it was very important, no? This idea of traditional idea of art as a space for failure, where failure is allowed as a creative device, you know? So I don't know how you put this...
It's true, and I think that's an interesting area to look at. And then you get the fact that the failure aesthetic becomes academicized. And that now I think we're at a point where the amateur aesthetic is becoming the academy model. More and more art students are working in this mode, and they're working with amateur culture. So then it really, what happens?
For art, also you can see like, for example, young artists become amateur artists because they're in formation. You know, this idea of, yeah, for young artists you can have an open call and have a more loose kind of a situation, but for professional artists you have a jury, like, you know, like a very selected, specific people, no?
Yeah.
You have this kind of space for whatever kind of situation. But at the same time, I'm curious why, I mean, I'm working a lot with arte útil, with useful art, so I will totally tell, for example, Chris Burden, go ahead and make this actually a prototype and actually make people use this if it really works.
Yeah.
So I feel like sometimes in the arts we get enough with just showing is possible instead of just, no?
It's
so
true.
we are amateur citizens in a way, amateur.
Yeah, or we need some kind of entrepreneur to work with people like Chris and go, actually, I can help make this. Because the artist often doesn't have the skills to create the company that then markets this product, etc. But yeah, it's interesting. Here's somebody who's obsessed with really dealing with technology and new solutions to things, but only as art.
So there is a limit.
He was interested in a different discussion.
Should we give the questions to the audience, perhaps? Okay. Yeah. Okay, who wants to ask something or comment? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have one because I've been like kind of involved a lot with these like kind of school projects that you showed, like both as a participant and lately as an organizer, and you made like a big point about like the accessibility. This becomes free, this goes out to the public and so on. But in my experience, I have a bit of a problem that maybe you can address, which is would go in like your initiative to ask like how did you advertise or make like this initiative known to the public? Because in my experiences, I love to be involved in these projects, but honestly, everyone going there, or 90% of the people going there, are postgrads. It's like...
postgraduates.
It's like you always find people with their MA in art, curating, or whatever, and they go to the free school, to the gallery, and they already paid like, I don't know, £40,000 for their like bachelor or MA, and then they have this new...
It's very interesting. I mean, I think, you know, certainly at the Hayward we got a lot of postgrads too, but we also got other people. But I think the key thing is to work with other places, other institutions, so that your school isn't having to start by itself. It's very funny. I mean, I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but Christoph Boichel? Yeah. He did a project in London where they turned the Hauser and Wirth Gallery into this senior citizen center. So it was a place where old people could go and learn dancing and do crafts, and every day that place was filled with old people who were not people who normally were going to art galleries. And he did it because he basically worked with a place that said you can have this space and I'll just create the environment for you. So I think you have to work with other organizations to get that public.
And your audience in the Wide Open School was mixed?
It was mixed. I mean, we had, you know, the problem is when you do a school for the public, most of the public is working. They can't go to it. That's why, for me, when an artist said, I want to teach 5 days every day, I was like, well, that means a lot of people aren't going to be able to take your class. Can you teach at night? Can you teach on the weekend? Can you somehow be flexible so people can do it? But we didn't do enough night school. I think that's a better project. But we did get different kinds of people, and people, interestingly, who remembered that this opportunities existed until Margaret Thatcher cut all the adult education programs in England. And so I was thinking, wow, this is this revolutionary thing we're doing. And then I had these older women coming up to me and saying, we used to do this back in the early 80s until Thatcher destroyed everything.
But to give some credit, it was in the summer, so a lot of people were on
Yeah, the one good thing was you could take a vacation, or I just let people could phone in sick.
Yeah. Then you'll have to pay for that.
Yeah.
Other questions? We continue always.
I have to ask Ralph a question. Can you expand a little bit on your notion of amateurism and how it's blurring with what was once called engaged art, or, as you said, you have to tie in, you have to use other organizations?
Well, I mean, what I'm talking about with amateur here is, it's a tricky issue, because technically an amateur is just someone who's not getting paid. And I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember when the Olympics were just for amateur athletes only. So it doesn't necessarily mean someone whose skill level isn't good. But in kind of colloquial use, in everyday use, to call someone an amateur usually means to dismiss them as someone who's not very competent, not highly trained, and usually not able to do a particular task. Well, that's just an amateur, right? People still use that outside of the art world. So I think there is this sense of the amateur is someone. I mean, I very much think Warhol nailed it, but it's someone who's unpredictable. They can't do the same thing every time the way a professional can in a performance. But that's an aesthetic of unpredictability and of not getting it right, which is very different from participation works. So for me, if you start going back with someone like Capra and his happenings, that's not about amateur activity. That's a different dynamic, which is about having people participate as the audience in the artwork. There's a whole group of artists who make films with amateurs including Javier Tellez, Joanna Billing, Artur Strzelecki, Joshua Okan. But usually they're using, and the amateurs they're using are usually people from a particular population, mental patients, children in Croatia who've lived through war, and it's their social status which lends meaning to the video, as well as the fact that as amateurs their performances aren't perfect, so that you don't see them just as creating a naturalistic illusion that an actor creates. You see them as an actual person struggling to deliver a performance. So this issue of struggling with mastery is part of this amateurism dynamic, but the other aspect is ingenious solutions that are outside of normal thinking. Unusual subject matter that most people ignore for one reason or another. So there are these, for me, two important parts of an amateur aesthetic, which has got nothing to do with the participatory works. Tino Sagasa uses amateurs, volunteers, and he pays them, but he trains them so much that they become professional Tino Segal performers. It's not about their amateur performance. It's not about the mistakes they make, the failures they have as a performer. It's about something else. So in that way, it's very specific, I think, this type of amateur thing that I'm looking at. And I think in the schools, it becomes about a kind of failure of a normal model of teaching and then to see what else happens. It is sometimes unpredictable. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work.
In the Summer Academy, I experienced that nobody, or nearly nobody, says I'm an amateur, but the amateurs are always the others. So we agree upon that in our school amateurs are taught together with artists, but there was never an amateur coming to me saying I'm the amateur.
Or I'm the teacher.
Yeah, perhaps the teacher, but in quotation marks. Other questions?
Maybe if you can talk something about what you think happens with the artist when he or she takes the position or act as the amateur in relation to responsibility. In, I don't know, choices, or I don't know, the Chris Burden car or whatever.
Well, it's funny, before this talk, Tanya and I were talking, and Tanya said, well, is there anyone who's taking on this kind of role as an amateur in another field who actually made a contribution that the people in that field were also interested in? And nothing really came to mind immediately. Because I do think it is a sense of you're performing as this amateur in another field. It's all very much about relationships and definitions that have to do with art and artists. So it is a rhetorical strategy to some extent, but at the same time, because it gets us into new territory that's interesting, I don't want to dismiss it as just a rhetorical strategy. It's about these relationships. So, I think artists are constantly getting into very interesting areas, but then they pull back into the art world. And again, if they didn't, they might become something else. Yeah. It's very interesting because people in other professions don't do this. I don't think lawyers and doctors are going around saying, actually, I'm a truck driver, and I'm just, but I'm really a lawyer, but.
I mean, when I thought about the video of André Sala, which is called The Road of Life or something like that, where he found a film with his mother without the sound.
Oh, yeah.
It's called Entrevista.
Entrevista, yeah. And here, for me, it's an example for how artists tell history without being historians, but of course artists were always historians and always writing history. But I mean, you could write a thick book like this as an historian about the same phenomena in Albania, post-communist Albania and communist Albania, but here you look at the video for half an hour and you know everything, and it's much more condensed. Yeah.
Maybe the problem is really with our just these big cultural categories we have. Someone's a historian, someone's not. Only historians deal with history, other people don't. I mean, there was some nice work by an artist from Los Angeles named Andrea Bowers, where she makes drawings, a series of drawings about civil disobedience training. So this is training for people who are going to be in a protest of some kind. They know the police are going to come and try to move them. How do you go live with your body? And it's sort of, she's become a historian of some of these civil disobedience movements in the United States. And they're obviously, that's our ultimate role in life as amateurs, is we're all, if we live in a democratic society, your role as citizen, you're an amateur. We obviously see governments that are becoming more and more professionalized, more and more run by professional interests. But really the most important thing everyone can do is to act as an amateur citizen. You don't get paid. You pay to be a citizen. But that's an amateur role.
There's a lot of fear about amateur, because for example,
we're so uptight.
But also curators for many, many years were just amateur. There were art historians who decided to be curators, and and then now everybody have to go to curator school, and so there is this kind of anxiety about the expert culture, in a way.
It is.
I don't know why.
No, it's true.
But other things are going the other way around. So.
Maybe. Or they both seem to be happening at the same time.
Sana, why don't you first and then
you? Just to cite a few non-artist amateurs who've kind of changed history, just to help you, I guess. Those two lovely gentlemen, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace, sample taker. One was studying divinity and went on a ship, and the other one was basically a sample collector and overseer. Then gardeners famously are fantastic amateurs who suddenly pop up fantastic experiments in genetics, particularly in monasteries. Gregor Mendel. Wasn't Ian Sinclair also a gardener at the Southwark Monastery before he started writing about London? I think he was a gardener at the Southwark Church. So there are these naturalist history people, fantastic amateurs, and I also actually maintain meticulous notebooks. So if just one looks at history of notebooks, one finds most fascinating.
No, I was struggling to think of an artist who had created, as an amateur in another field, something that was important in that field. I agree with you, there are many important amateur discoveries made all the time. There still are.
Thank you. My question is, so we've divided the artists into two groups, like professionals and amateurs, but can we say that there is also two art, professional and amateur, because art is art, so how to come to that, and who establishes them as amateur or not?
Well, I think a lot of times the amateur artists, including, or people who don't even think of themselves as artists. They think of what they do as a hobby. They're not participating in any kind of conversation or dialogue with other artists about what work means. And so then it's the artist who comes along and says, look at this type of performance, or look at this type of painting that's being made. And this seems more interesting actually than a lot of things in the art world. So I think there's always a level of criticism in this work, even when it's very indirect, because it is being presented in the art world. It's not like someone's just putting this on YouTube or showing it for a non-art audience. It's aimed at the art audience. And so some of it is you know, there's a lot of complicated, I think, psychological things going on.
Yeah, but I would say actually that maybe amateur, I mean, I don't know, it's a little cynical, but just thinking about this, might be the artist who is not willing to play the game of the art world.
Partly, and yet the other thing there is that so many artists I know are really interested in underground subcultural phenomena. They research it, they have collections. I mean, Cindy Sherman's thing in Venice was great. She hadn't made that public before, but you looked at it and you thought, wow, this obviously makes sense. I mean, these photo albums of transvestites from the 1970s, that looked like her work from the last 10 years. These older women with bad makeup who, because the transvestite is like an amateur woman, right? It's like kind of failing and looking like a woman, but, you know, more or less trying. So I think that artists are genuinely interested in a lot of this work, a lot of artists. I don't think it's a cynical thing.
No, but I mean, like, once you're really interested in becoming part of the art world,
yeah,
even if you're an amateur, then you are not an amateur anymore. Because then you start learning all these rules, games, and situation.
It's true. It is very interesting. There's a guy in Japan, and I forget his name, but he's sort of like slightly older, but he's like the Cameron Jamie of Japan. But his career, interestingly, has been making popular books. So no presence in the art world, but he makes these books about weird Japanese cultural phenomenon that sell enough copies so that he's like a famous bookmaker. And, you know, it's so interesting what happens when you look at something that looks like, you know, it's a book, you see it at the bookshop, you know those kind of funny books they had, or somebody who's presenting in a gallery. What we read those things so differently.
But I think it's different when, I think it's different when you're a guest at a house than when you want to buy in that building, you know? So everything changes. Everybody can be like, oh, he's just here for one drink and dinner. Yeah. Whatever he burps in front of everybody, doesn't matter. But if you want to live there, then there's all these rules that you have to understand.
But I mean, when you just publish the book, then you're not engaging in all this rhetorical relationships.
Yeah. You live in another town.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is also what happened to Araki, because he also had all these books and magazines, and then all of a sudden he went into the art world, and his photographs became huge and everywhere, all art fairs. Yeah. There was another question back there, I think.
Probably that's even not a question, but like replica. Here you mentioned that nobody said, trying to apply to this Fine Arts Academy in Salzburg, that he or she is like an amateur, but not an artist, or not a professional artist. I think it's quite predictable because of this condition, always be afraid of, do not be like a professional. And so I see this endless contradiction between contemporary art industry, because as Tania said, it's really industry, and each amateur pilots just from the beginning. And I think it will take I don't know, even a lot of years that an amateur will have, or will get the possibility to apply to your academy, which is of course a part of this industry to some extent. But it's a part of this industry, and it's not about amateurship at all, from my opinion. Yeah, and So,
can you say it again? I didn't understand. It's not about amateur work?
Yeah, I mean, this academy, even it's to much extent, it's about professional contemporary art industry. And all the lectures or like, teachers, tutors are very professionalized. I mean, even they are very established in contemporary art sphere or industry or area, etc. And of course, to apply to this course, you have to be, or you have to seem or imagine yourself as an artist, not as an amateur. Yes, so I'm just wondering about the loneliness of this contradiction between this industry where you have to earn money and you have to be part of it, and this amateurship, this amateur being of like, living of being, because that's really like a problem for many artists and young people who do not have opportunity to get this like professional art schools or education, and that is why they do not have opportunity to be exhibited in so-called white cubes and etc. etc. So you do not, they do not have opportunity to earn money and to confirm themselves. Yeah, so that's a very economical question. Thank you.
What to say, to be honest? I have no answer for you right now.
It is interesting. I was thinking, this is a slightly skewed response to this, but preparing for this talk, I was just thinking, what if, because the Wide Open School is going to happen in China in May, in Hangzhou, and in China, we're working with an art school there, but also a great newspaper. It's the second largest newspaper in China, and it has an amazing editor. It's a very cool guy who he was a factory worker, and he taught himself how to write. He's become the editor of this newspaper, and he believes that a newspaper should create culture, not just report on it. So they organize concerts, they do all kinds of things, and it's without having a newspaper involved, I wouldn't do it, because this Wide Open School shouldn't be an art school. That doesn't feel wide open enough. But this school has some of the best Chinese artists teaching there, but it is, on one level, like a factory. When they have their applications, they have 9,000 students apply. In a 4-day period, they all do the same life drawing test. 9,000 students in this huge football stadium, and the judges come around and they have 10 seconds to look at each person's work. So you talk about an industry, this is a real, true industrialization of that academic process. But I did think about the idea that what if every gallery and museum in the world stopped showing art and turned themselves into a wide open school? What would happen? If the public, the users of art, actually become much more making art and using art more creatively, could we reach a point where that difference between artists who are special people and people who are just special artists because they make interesting things really stopped being such a big deal? And of course, there's too much money involved for that to happen. But it's an interesting idea, I think. That's the utopia of the amateurs.
Taking over the world. Yeah, perhaps we'll leave it here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, the audience, and thank you especially TANIA BRUGUERA and RALPH RUGOFF.